to learn. If you create the context to allow young people to be able to learn, there won't be any academic standard. If you just give them the information, they will skirt around it and jump around it. So the question then becomes, Emdin, how then do you create the appropriate context for allowing kids to be fully actualized where they want to learn? Well, the only way you can do that is by making the teaching and learning space one that makes them comfortable. Well, how do you make it comfortable? By actually bringing in the nuances of the culture of what makes them who they are. So the question is then, why don't we do it? Well, we don't do it because we have perceptions about culture. When I said hip-hop, I looked around, some smiled, some said okay, some said oh boy. And I brought that in the beginning on purpose because if you want to welcome the true culture to create the context for learning, you have to go to places where the kids are from, like hip-hop, like dance, like, and this is going to piss you off a little bit, but like that non-traditional, non-academic language that they use. Some of you English teachers cringe when you hear a double negative. Understandably so. But you cannot teach someone to be able to speak in the language and discourse of power if you don't first welcome the localized languages that they have. You do not create the appropriate context for learning until you first allow the culture of the young people to be explicitly present in that classroom. And that may not look the way that you want it to look, but it has to look that way, otherwise we're replicating that image. And I make the argument that you can get them where you want them to go if you realize the different paths to getting there. You guys all heard that Einstein phrase, Christianity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And we fool ourselves into thinking that we're doing things differently, but in essence, we're doing the same thing over and over again, but aiming at something different. Like we said, it's out, but we'll go there later. And to be more explicit, that's the image of a school in 1890. One in 1990, and one set of photos that I took in 2014. And it's the exact same type of pedagogy. Teacher up front, students listening, taking notes, and somebody's going to say, well, not at my school, we sit in groups of 4. So if we sit in groups of 4, that means that we're doing something differently. Do you know that it doesn't really freaking matter if we sit in groups of 4 or not? And the approach to instruction is the exact same? And we do those things, you know why we do them? Because we're trying to convince ourselves that we're doing things differently. Right? It's like, well, if we sit them in 4, then it means that they're talking to each other. Yeah, but they were talking to each other when they were in rows anyway. And the conversation when they sit in groups of 4 and when they're sitting in rows is still, that dude is boring and I don't want to be here. So my next phase in this conversation is these powerful quotes from these iconic folks. Oh man, I write that down. Who to me are at the core of what it means to truly teach and to educate. And I'm going to spend a few minutes just teasing these out. The first one by Albert Einstein, who's my hero. I call him my OG, right? Original gangster, no science like Einstein. Education is what remains. By the way, let's take a quick time out. Do you understand, or are you okay with the fact that I sort of purposely go back and forth between colloquial language and sort of canonical and academic language? Who's noticed that? Who thinks it's accidental? Okay, good. It's a purposeful thing, right? And what I'm trying to do in this process is to model that for you, right? To model this notion of a hybridized identity, which is significant, right? And a hybridized identity necessarily says that you bring in multiple selves into the learning space. And once that happens, then people can then actually learn. And that's actually what you want to do with young people, to bring their authentic, hybridized selves into a learning space. Some of you right now are school leaders, and nobody in your school would even think this is you. You got t-shirts on and shirts and hanging out, and they're like, when you wear the tie, they don't even think you own a t-shirt. You know why that's the case? Because you've enacted a certain identity in that school space, right? And that's the self that you bring to that space. And I make the argument that if you bring that self to that space, you're never able to truly actualize. If you've got that dressed out thing. The idea is that you want to bring multiplicities of experiences and cultures into that classroom space. You know what? I won't even go here. Let me tell you a quick story. Just to drive to this point. That got me my zone. So, my first year as a professor at Teachers College, I walked into the faculty meeting, right? And as I walk into the faculty meeting, one of the notes I got, my sort of pre-emails is, welcome to the faculty. The first thing we want you to do is to be able to identify a faculty member that's going to be your mentor. Following the story so far. So I go into the faculty room, I walk in, I see a whole bunch of folks, they all look smart. I walk in there, and I scan the room, like, oh my gosh, who's going to be my advisor? Who am I going to ask, right? And I look around, and I saw one dude in the corner, right? And a dude in the corner, he was black, and that was enough for me. I was like, all right, that's my faculty advisor, right? Right? We're gonna talk about this. I have time with you guys today. Like, why would I pick him, right? We have this amazing book by Tatum, Why All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria. Anybody read that? Powerful book. I recommend it. So I go and I find a black dude. After the faculty meeting's over, I walk up to him and I say, hey, I'm Chris Emdin. I'm a new faculty member here. Thank you so much for your presence, just because you're here, and I'd like you to be my advisor. He looked at me, kind of stuck his nose up in the air, and turned away. And I was crushed, right? I was like, oh my gosh, now it's no one who's going to be my advisor. And I went back home, and I cried into my pillow. And then next week, I come up and I was like, I'm not going to let this guy just not do this. He's going to be my advisor. So I walk up to him again and I say, hey, I'm Chris Emdin. I really want you to be my advisor. I was sold to find one. And then he starts speaking. When he starts speaking, he says, well, I didn't know if that's going to be possible this semester, right? In that accent. And then I turned away and I was a little disappointed, but I was like, oh, now I get it. The reason why he doesn't want to be my advisor is because he's British, right? Maybe like I'm here like Brooklyn, New York Chris, like, little son, be my advisor. And he's like, no. So I'm like, that's what it is. So the black thing didn't work, but it's because we're from different places why he's not willing to be my advisor. You follow me, right? So now, a week later, I still can't identify anyone. And as I can't identify anyone, I'm one day in the hallway, and this older woman walks past, and she says, Emdin, you're new here, aren't you? And I said, like, instantly, like, yes, ma'am. But she had, like, this whole, like, sort of, like, just like an air around her, right? And she says, well, you know you were supposed to have a faculty advisor. You seem not to have picked one. You just don't think you need one, huh? And I was like, no, that's not it at all. And she had this air about it, and she was like, okay, come to my office. And I immediately, I felt I was transported back to, like, grade school when your mom's like, go home, or like principal's office. So I'm like, I grab my bag and I'm like, okay, my God, you trouble, right? And I go into her office and we start talking. It's an older white woman, right? And we were talking and joking, and she's herself, and she's joking. I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, I immediately felt so comfortable. Like, I was going the whole time to find the other black dude, right? And then it's like this older white lady who just makes me feel the most comfortable ever. I'm like, well, this in itself is crazy, right? So we're going back and forth, we were talking, and she talked about white union advisor, and then she said, well, seriously, why don't you just tell me the truth? Why didn't you pick someone? And I said, well, I went to Professor XYZ, and I thought we were going to get along really well, but I figured that we wouldn't, because, you know, after I started talking to him, I found out he was British, right? And she goes, huh? That motherfucker's from Arkansas, right? The dust settled a little bit, right? Excuse my dog, but the dust settled a little bit, and I stood there and I was like, wow, that's interesting. And then it all started to make sense, right? He, being an older professor in that space, particularly an older black professor, probably came from a history of where you need to have a certain decorum and presence in order to be professor. And so he started constructing an identity for himself over years that equaled also wearing tweed jackets with suede patches and being British, right? To the point where he had so constructed this identity in that space that a person who tried to authentically connect to him, he couldn't connect to, right? And all I could think to myself was, wow, I couldn't connect to this guy who I'm sure I could have learned a lot from, and maybe he could have learned some things from me because of him constructing this identity. And then I go to this other woman, and the reason why I learned so much from her and felt so comfortable is because she was authentically who she was. Like, nagging older mom personified with professor at the same time. But even though it was nagging old mom professor identity, it was fully who she was, and because it was fully who she was, that became the person I connected to, and that's what I learned the most from about the institution. And the guy who I thought was the guy who was going to be the guy for me, because he had constructed this identity, inhibited his ability to be able to connect and teach me. You guys understand now? And so the point is, to truly understand how to teach from someone's standpoint requires authentically allowing them to be themselves, but concurrently being ourselves, so we can showcase what it means to be fully present in a teaching and learning space because that is the tool for transformative pedagogy. See, teaching and learning is a dance, people. You know this. And part of me for being romantic about this, right? But you dance, and when you're dancing, there are certain points where the partner leads, and then you lead, and then there's the dip, and then there's the spin, and unless you're fluidly present in that space, the dance can't happen. So what I'm asking you to do before we step forward is understand that you have to allow the kids to be themselves, and then concurrently, you have to be yourself. When you go to a doctor's office, what's the first thing you see when you walk into that building or on its walls? There's degrees on full display. I go to principals' offices all the time, school districts all the time, and that stuff's not there. Why? Because we've been conditioned as educators to extract out that piece of who we are. You went on vacation this summer. Do your kids know about it? You know how many kids you have? Do you know how many kids you have? You know what you like to do for fun? They know what music you listen to? All those things are not going to be taught in a traditional education program. But those things are the most significant pieces to teaching and learning. My mom always said when I was growing up, Chris, do you know little drops of water make a mighty ocean? I had no idea what the hell she was talking about. We lived right in Flatbush, there was no beach around. And I thought she was nice. But what she was saying didn't make sense until I became a teacher. So I went to earn a degree in education and start realizing that, man, all the stuff that they taught me makes no sense. Because the stuff that really makes me a powerful educator are the little drops and nuggets of who I authentically am that I bring to that class and that creates the mighty ocean of change. You still with me? So let's move along. First quote. Education is what remains after one has forgotten what one has learned in school. Who believes that? Not too many. I'm going to try to convince you that that's the case. Listen, remember we talked about the definition? I'm going to say the same things over and over again. By the way, the reason why I keep driving home certain points and saying them 3 times, I'll just give you a little backdrop. Sociologists have said that every continued pattern action becomes a ritual. Before something can become a ritual, it has to be enacted or said or done at least 3 times. If I say it once and it becomes an empty soundbite, it's gone. If I say it at least 3 times, like, this dude might really mean this point, it becomes held on to. All right? So education is what remains after you leave school. It's not the information that's taught. Who knows a person who was the most smart kid in school? Got all A's all throughout, brilliant, affirmed for their intelligence, and then you see them a couple years later and you're like, dude, what happened? That narrative happens all the time. Because schooling only fosters a certain type of intelligence, and survival in the real world requires a different one. So what you want to be able to do as an educator is to create not just a delivery of information and content, but the larger context to allow a person to be able to leave school with a deep desire to engage in the learning process. Again, because your job is not to deliver the information. Your job is to be able to create the context to allow a person to feel like they want to learn so much that they become fully actualized. Second powerful quote. I've never let my school interfere with my education. Which is, the point here is to make a very powerful distinction. You want to teach from the standpoint of the student, to make a powerful distinction between schooling and education. What is schooling? The routine. This class and next class. I mean, some of the routines that we've inherited in education are mind-boggling. So I come from this perspective as a science educator. I have no idea why in the heck we still teach the sciences in the order that we do nationally. Right? It makes no sense. So we do earth science, maybe, then bio, chemistry, physics. Any other science people in the building? Oh, yeah, we're deep in here. Oh, science, gang. All right, so, look. And when you think about those processes of why schools across the country use the same process of science, and it blew my mind because I taught conceptual physics first in high school. And I realized that teaching conceptual physics opens up kids so much